Hello, my name is Dennis Daly and I'm an interviewer with the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. Today I'm interviewing Mr. Jerry Ransohoff, and it is September 19th, 2006. We're at the main library. Mr. Ransohoff, thank you very much for being part of this project and doing this interview. And I guess the best way to start off would be to talk about a little bit about your background before the war and how you came to be in the service.
Well, I came to be in the service because I had a relatively low draft number, and I was a reporter on the Enquirer after graduating from university. One of the things I was covering was the induction station for Thomas. Sergeant Major said, how's your draft number? And I said, it's fairly low. He said, if you volunteer, we can get you to the Air Corps. He said, it's the first draftees going into the Air Corps, and we got a good deal. So I went back and turned in my number and said, I'll volunteer. And the next day I got my card saying greetings, and I was in the service. And after a couple of years in San Antonio, I was an enlisted man. I went and took the officer training course at Miami Beach. Went from Miami Beach, got my commission, went up to Morrison Field, which is West Palm Beach, and had a 6-month course in cryptology. Went from there out the Aleutian.
Now, did you enlist before Pearl Harbor, or was it after?
Yeah,
it was before.
I enlisted in August.
So the
and then Pearl Harbor in December.
Okay, so 41.
Yeah.
So there was a draft already in place before?
Oh yes.
Okay, that was
draft was 2 years, 3 years before that.
Okay.
And you had you drew your number, and that determined when you went in. And they also had a 1-year voluntary enlistment, which you go in ahead of your number, and that's what I did.
So after you got your commission, and then you were sent to the Aleutians,
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about what your first impressions were.
The Aleutians are a chain of islands 1,000 miles long, reaching from the end of Alaska mainland up towards the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. And they are flat. They have grass about a foot long, and that's all they're covered, green covered. It's very heavy, but it's only green. There are no trees, nothing any higher than a big dog. And Adak was, they're hilly. They drained a bunch of lake beds on them to make runways. And as much as possible, flew at least 2 engine planes. You didn't want to be out there with a single engine, because if you had a ditch, you only could last about 35 minutes in that cold water. So they had 2 engines to keep them cool. I went out there as a cryptographic officer, which meant I was responsible to see that the codes were controlled right, and these are codes in which we coded our own messages. These are communication between various levels and various units in the service. And most of the stuff went in restricted or secret code. And they had enlisted men did all the translating, and so my responsibility was to see that the codes were properly controlled or protected, and that the message were translated as they should be.
So you actually had knowledge of what the message was, and then you encrypted it into
Yeah.
the code, and then sent the code off to the enlisted
Right.
men, who then transferred the message
Right.
through code. Okay.
And most of the time, enlisted men did the transfer.
Okay.
And I was on duty one night, a message came through saying that it was an executive order from FDR saying that all units had to have historical officers. All units of wing or bigger had to have full-time historical officers. And so I delivered that message to the general myself. I said, I'd like the job. And he said, what's your background? I told him. I said, fine, you're going to have it. Saved him the trouble of looking up whether there were too many of the crypto officers anyhow. So I spent the next 3 years writing the history of the air war in the Pacific, primarily the history of the 11th Air Force.
Were you, so this, every unit had a historian, right?
Every unit had to have a historian
Okay.
to put the history together. Anything bigger than a wing had to have a full-time. Since we were an Air Force, we had to have a full-time historical officer. And they didn't know what the historical officer should do, so I really could write my own ticket.
Maybe you could explain real quick how the Air Corps was set up. When you say wing, that, I'm assuming that was a division.
A wing is a division, a squadron is a division, and depending upon the size of the Air Force, you have squadrons and wings. Squadrons make up wings, and wings make up headquarters.
Okay.
And the 11th Air Force, I don't know when you have a picture of the shoulder patch, is a half a wing. And the 11th Air Force was half a wing. We had a couple squadrons of heavies, a squadron of medium bombers, and a squadron of P-38s, and that was about the entire Air Force. We would drop bombs on Kiska and measure them in pounds rather than tons. Yeah. We'd have 1,500 tons, and in Europe they'd have 1,500 aircraft. We were 1,500 pounds of bomb. And after we, I'll put it this way, sort of got tired of bombing Kiska, we sent planes across the Pacific to bomb the northern end of Kuriil Islands. And they would carry bomb bay tanks to get over and back, maybe 1,000 pounds of bombs. Whereas this would be a third of what they would carry through in Europe. It was an interesting theater.
Maybe you can explain also some the situation. Kiska was an island, an Aleutian island.
Kiska was one of the Aleutian islands.
That the Japanese island?
The Aleutian island, the Japanese sent a fleet, including cruisers and destroyers and submarines, to try to occupy Dutch Harbor in coordination with the Battle of Midway. The Japanese fleet came north and came out of the fog, more or less. But what they didn't know is that back in 1940, we had started fortifying and building air bases in the Alaskan Peninsula. We had 2 air bases in which we based land-based attack planes. And they came out of the fog the other side and attacked the Japanese fleet. The Japanese fleet turned around and started back towards Midway, and then went back farther out and occupied Kiska and Attu.
Okay.
we had a weather station on Kiska and nothing on Attu. So there were no loss for us. And a pain in the neck for the Japanese to occupy. But since it was American soil, we put troops out there to try to take them back, or at least be sure they didn't come any farther up the chain towards Alaska.
Is that the furthest they got?
First they got was Kiska.
How long did they occupy Kiska?
3 years.
So through the end of the war, pretty
Yeah,
much?
yeah. They, towards the end of the war, we first attacked Attu, Marine Division 3. And this was incidentally also the first banzai charge of the Japanese. But we occupied Kiska. Japanese all committed suicide. We did not, wait, I'm sorry, we occupied Attu, yeah. We did not occupy Kiska. We did go ashore consistent with some of the landing in Japan and found that the Japanese had left, taken off by submarine.
So, now you were stationed on
ADAC.
ADAC.
Yeah. I was with the headquarters, 11th Air Force,
Okay.
which was on ADAC.
And there were sorties that took off from bases there. Is that
Well,
correct?
in the early days, most of the attack on Kiska and Attu came from Manchitka
Okay.
and a little island called Shemya, which was about 10 miles long, 5 miles wide, but absolutely flat. It was a sort of a stationary base.
So there weren't a lot of planes taking off from the island you were on.
No.
So what was life like on ADAC, and what sort of day-to-day stuff went on there in your
Day-to-day
experience there?
stuff was very interesting. There's a lot of drinking. We had a funnel club, as we called it. We had friends up in the Aleutian, mainland of Alaska, who would buy liquor for us and send it down in the general's communications pouch. And so we stayed pretty well supplied. And then we found a better way. We started buying liquor from the Navy. $5 for a bottle of bonded bourbon. Did pretty well.
So the Navy was always pretty well supplied?
The Navy was very well. Navy had liquor. The Army didn't.
Okay.
So we would buy from the Navy did not like bourbon. They preferred Scotch. So the provider said, well, you got to buy so and so much bourbon before you can have a bottle of Scotch. And these guys would get the bourbon, we'd buy the bourbon from them. They didn't care, they wanted the Scotch. The other thing, we would play a hell of a lot of bridge. God. I won't play anymore.
Got your fill?
I got my fill. It was fun, and we were pretty good bridge players. You learn after a while, after you've been playing for a couple of years, you learn to read the card pretty well.
Did you play it all once you got back, or was it pretty much once the war was
No,
over?
I haven't played. I don't play with my wife. She loves bridge.
So you were the wing historian? Is that what you would have been considered, or
What?
the wing historian, or when you were the historian for the Union?
I was historian for the Air Force.
For the entire 11th Air Force?
Yes.
Okay. And that's pretty much what were you also doing that in conjunction with encrypting, or once you became
Oh,
a
no,
historian?
once I got out of
That was it, okay.
photography entirely and was full-time. And my job was to see that the units wrote their own histories and submitted them. So I have a collection of all the units that wrote histories or that were active in the 11th Air Force in North Pacific.
And that was going to be my next question. So you retain a copy to the Army or the Air Force? They also have copies?
No, I went to headquarters of the Air Corps, Army Air Corps.
Okay. And they kept them on file there?
They kept them on file there, and I kept a file. And it's about 600 pages.
Have you ever thought of publishing?
The copies of selections have been published.
Okay.
One called The 1,000-Mile War, and there are several novels, not novels, just histories.
I asked this to a gentleman who flew in the Pacific who I was interviewing. He hadn't read the book, but this is just sort of out of curiosity. Did you ever read Catch-22 after the war?
Yeah.
Did that seem to be pretty close on what life was like in the Air Force?
Oh yes. It was an interesting theater because it wasn't terribly active. I said with the 2 squadrons of heavies and a squadron of mediums, you really didn't have much going on.
Mm-hmm.
And they could only, out of a month, they could only maybe fly half time because of the weather. That was our big problem. The weather is made over there.
Mm-hmm.
And they were not so much interested in knowing whether the target was going to be clear as where they'd have a clear base to go back to.
Right.
And if they take off from Manchester, for example, they would fly over and they'd want to be able to get all the way back to Anchorage if they had to.
Just in terms of where the clear landing?
Where it's not a clear landing. Yeah.
So now mostly was the action, the targets for the bombers that took off here, were they also the Aleutians or did they?
No, they were in the northern end of the Japanese archipelago.
Okay.
And also the Kuril Islands, which have been occupied by the Japanese. Kuril Islands of Russia. And we go over and drop a few bombs on the airports, on the hangars, turn around and come back.
It wasn't like Europe or?
No, it wasn't. They didn't have many attack planes. It's a fairly safe trip if your gas held out, your engines kept running. And these were the best kept engines in probably the entire aircraft, because that was your big problem.
Right.
The other thing that they had out in the North Pacific, we had the best navigation aids, because that was the only way sure of getting back.
So wintertime was probably?
There was no winter time. It was always winter.
Always winter?
Well, it was like Cincinnati in March and February.
Temperature-wise and?
Temperature-wise, weather-wise.
Heavy cloud cover most of the time?
Cloud cover, raining, snow pellets.
So you basically would wait for the weather to clear and then
Wait for the
fly
weather.
a mission?
And we clear in both places, over the target and at some base back in the Aleutians.
I know we've got a gentleman coming on Thursday I believe he was a weatherman in Alaska. So that'll be interesting to see how, and that must have been one of the major, most important.
We had very good weather services.
Mm-hmm. You would have to be able to try to find those kind of windows to fly in. So it sounds like boredom was probably one of your biggest enemies up there.
Boredom, or if you really wanted to do a lot of reading. I did an awful lot of reading. One of the things I discovered there was the race to a hornblower.
I'm familiar with
And you can imagine that what that was to be reading
that. The whole series?
that whole series,
Yeah, that would have
or
been.
as they came out.
Were those being published during World War II?
It was published in the Saturday Evening Post.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
So you wait for the
Wait
mail to come.
wait for the mail to
Your
come.
next installment.
Right.
Did you get any leave when you were there to go into?
I came home once.
Okay.
It was a long trip.
I would imagine.
But I can't, well, I had been dating this woman before World War II. And she had gotten married to a Canadian who was a bomber pilot. He had been killed. And she joined the Canadian Air Force. And she had a leave at the same time I did. We didn't know it. We were both in Cincinnati. We met and started corresponding again and got together and got married and have 4 children.
That's a great story. So she was married, and you dated, she married, and then she actually joined the Canadian Air Force.
She joined the Canadian. Her husband was a Canadian.
So what did they consider? I'm trying to think of what the female Air Force in the U.S. would consider. They weren't waves. They were wax.
Wax.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Women's Air Corps.
Was there something like that in?
The Canadians had the same.
They were called wax
Yeah.
also. Okay. Was she scheduled? Was she stationed in Canada, or did she go overseas?
She was stationed out in Gander, Newfoundland.
Okay. That's a great story.
And she had, just by chance, had leave at the same time I did.
You would have never reconnected
That's
if that
right.
had been the case.
That's right.
How long was your leave when you had leave?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. So what was your trip like back from the Aleutians to Cincinnati? How did you make that trip?
Hitchhiked.
Really?
Well, I hitchhiked on Army, Navy, and aircraft. They were all glad, to hang around the what do you call it? Or the pilots.
Hangars?
Stay around where planes are being serviced.
Okay.
And which way are you going? Where are you going? Chicago. Fine.
So you hitched a lot of plane rides?
Well, it's one from Adak to Anchorage, one from Anchorage to Chicago to Cincinnati.
No, I was just curious if there were any trains or boats involved in that.
Oh, no.
You flew all the way?
I know, flew all the way.
So how long did that take you? About
A week.
a week?
All depends how you make connections.
Certainly couldn't do that today, I would think.
Sure you could.
Just hitch a ride with you're in the service?
Yeah. If you're in the service yourself,
Right.
they're glad to take you.
That's good. That's good. So now there's been a couple of points that I've talked to and other interviewers have talked to that have sort of stuck out. And the first one is when FDR died. Do you remember how you got the news about FDR?
I sure do. We were eating lunch, and Colonel Davenport, Bill Davenport, who was an intelligence officer, came running up the hill to our mess hall, and he was crying. I said, Bill, what happened? He said, FDR just died. And some officers applauded.
Really?
And I turned to this one and I said, you motherfucker. Seemed to be the appropriate word.
Sure. Now I have never heard any stories of anyone applauding. I knew there were Republicans out there.
He had a lot of Republicans.
But to take pleasure,
Yeah.
yeah, and most people I've talked to, I don't know if you had this feeling, it was almost like they lost a parent.
Oh, yes. But there were people who hated him. and they didn't mind saying so. And Colonel Davenport was a strong Democrat, had the right attitude. FDR was quite a guy.
And it seems to me that most people who were in the service that I've talked to really consider, the gentleman earlier today was talking about how he didn't know if Truman could lead like FDR.
No, nobody knew that. Truman turned out to be a remarkable surprise.
Mm-hmm.
FDR was in Cincinnati in 1936.
On the campaign trail?
I was a student at the university at the time and was in the group that interviewed him. So we quite a magnetic personality.
And then, of course, the next major event that I like to ask people about is, do you remember where you were when the bomb was dropped? Or getting the news about the atomic bomb? And maybe kind of what your feelings were when you heard it.
Yeah. I was out in Aleutian then, and they reported that a bomb had been dropped, which caused a fantastic amount of damage. And I'd been reading, there was a lot about fission and fusion in Encyclopedia Britannica. I was in intelligence then, and one of the things we did was brief the general and the staff on what was going on. And my responsibility turned out to be to describe what we know about the bomb. Well, I got a hold of Britannica and started reading Britannica and constructed a hydrogen bomb rather than a fission bomb.
Oh, really?
But at that point we knew it was over. The Aleutians were a pretty quiet theater. I was saying, aside from bridge and reading, there wasn't much else to do. You couldn't drink. And I imagine a lot of alcoholics came out of that theater.
A lot of heavy drinking.
Yeah.
Not a lot of idle time sometimes.
But,
If you have a lot of idle time,
yeah,
sometimes
there was,
it's
well,
the way to pass it.
there was idle time.
But it was different times then. You know?
Yeah, well, they had some 19,000 troops there for the occupation of Kiska,
Okay.
and they didn't do anything.
So not long after the bomb was dropped, obviously
It was over.
it was over.
Yeah.
And that came across. Did you just
yeah.
have the message?
Oh, we knew right away that there was not much to be done.
Right. So how long after that were you discharged, or and
See,
what?
the bomb was dropped in, I'm trying to remember now,
It was August of 45.
August.
I think at least the
August.
second one was
August,
August.
yeah. And I got out in October of 45. Because right after that, they started negotiating for peace. It was quite a decision Truman had to make on the bomb, because they knew what it would do. And at the time, I don't think we knew, some of us did have a pretty good idea of what it meant. It was the end of war as we know it. the Aleutians were, if you had the gumption to be satisfied with reading and playing bridge, it's a nice theater.
Not a lot of danger.
Not a lot.
Which,
No.
that would have been my kind of theater.
It's Aleutian had an attack by 5 or 6 baddies, Japanese 2-inch bombers. And that was the only activity we had in 3 years.
Now, did they attack the island you were on?
Aleutian.
Had to?
At the end.
Okay.
Very end.
So how far away was that island, would you say, from where you were stationed?
500, 600 miles.
Okay.
The last 600 miles they couldn't make. They hit, there was nothing that wasn't very much in that too.
Was there ever any thought, and this is just something that popped into my mind, but I know that after Germany surrendered, the Russians declared war on Japan.
Yeah.
And I would assume that the Aleutians come fairly close, like you said, they end in Russian territory. Was there any ever kind of contact with the Soviets?
No contact.
Okay.
The only thing was that the Petropavlovsk, which was an air base in the Kamchatka Peninsula, in the extreme eastern Russia, was our only landing base. The plane got in trouble, couldn't make it back to the Aleutians. They could land in Petropavlovsk. And there was an international news service reporter by the name of George McWilliams. We knew about what happened. If the plane landed in Petro, Russia kept the plane and shipped the crew back through Tehran and Iran back to the States. And it was quite a trip across Russia by train. And George McWilliams who was a reporter, wanted to make that trip, and he got to the point that no matter what plane he went on or what happened, it never landed in Petro. It got back.
So I guess people thought he was a good luck charm.
It's a good luck charm.
Yeah. That's interesting. They kept the plane then.
And they kept the plane.
Well, I wonder if they wanted to look at the technology there.
Among other things. But that would be their main.
Yeah. So after the war, do you want to maybe talk about what you did after the war?
Well, after the war, I got married in November of 1946. I guess it was 46 or 45. 45.
Don't let your wife see this. You don't remember the year you got married.
I remember the date.
There you go. That's good.
No, because we got married in 45. Because she had to go back and get discharged from the Canadian Army, or Canadian Air Corps. And I had to finish up my history and take it to Washington and get into the library there. There was they had a whole section of the Air Corps devoted to doing histories. History of the 8th Air Force is yay thick.
Mm-hmm.
Mine was this thick. But it tells the story of what happened. And the headquarters of the 11th Air Force of the Army Air Corps was pretty adamant that everybody had their histories. So this war is probably the best document of any war we've ever been involved
were you, now you got discharged, so you didn't stay in the reserves or anything like that? Or?
I stayed in the reserves for about a year.
Okay.
And then when they started getting involved again in getting drafting officers back, I resigned my commission.
Before the career?
I wasn't about to come back. I had almost 6 years.
Okay.
Or 5 years, 41 through 46.
Then you went into, did you go back into journalism after?
I went to the, well, I was married and I didn't want to work at, the Enquirer worked at night. I didn't want to work at night, so I went to the Post, worked at the Post. And got a full-time job as a reporter and then did a lot of writing about health and medicine. And so when they started the hospital council, they asked me if I would do it. So I went from the Post to the hospital council.
Okay.
Stayed there for 25 years.
Around, was that located in Clifton, around Cincinnati?
Yeah, it's where I wanted it, wherever I wanted it to be.
Okay. Sounds good. Now, see, and this is something that I've commented on in doing these interviews. What's really interesting about this is that we're getting the stories that you oftentimes don't read in history books, and day-to-day life in the Aleutians is.
Well, the day-to-day life was pretty boring.
But I think
you had to have the resources,
right,
to make it interesting. You weren't going to make the Aleutians interesting. The weather was just god awful all the time. There was rain, snow that came in little round pellets about the size of BB shot, and blowing. And then in August, when the congressman came, the sun came out. They call that congressional weather.
There you go. I've never heard that expression before. That's good. But yeah, I think that it's very important that people learn about the Aleutians, because it's not something that I was really even familiar with before we started this project.
Yeah.
And it was, a very important theater of the war.
Well, it wasn't an important theater, it was a necessary theater. And it was important that we not let the Japanese come any farther up into the Aleutian mainland. The Japanese were very unintelligent about what they could do, could have done in Alaska. A handful of planes that came from the two air bases that were built on the mainland, at Fort Glenn and Port Hyde. They could not have stopped the Japanese if they wanted to keep on going. They got scared and turned around. And we were lucky.
What do you think they got scared of? The prospect of what was there?
The prospect of land-based planes attacking them. And they had no idea that the land-based planes were there. These were built in 1940, 41 as fish packing plants. Scott and Company and Blair and Company, they had all this equipment that was shipped out, but it was air-based equipment shipped out to concealed bases. First time they used that Marston matting, steel matting in runways, and it worked.
Well, sir, is there anything else that you would like to add today, or?
No, I think about all the guys that I knew out there that have gone on. Not many of us left. I'll be 90 next year.
You're still a young man. Now, do you, were you able to have reunions throughout the years and keep in touch?
We kept in touch. A number of us kept in touch.
Okay.
And occasionally used to visit. We had very good friends that were in New York. We go to New York at least 2 or 3 times a year and party. Party night.
That is one of the main reasons why we're doing the interviews. Is it's the sad truth that we're losing a lot of World War II veterans every day. And it's a very important part of our history that we need to capture here. So.
And we all lived in Quonset huts. And if we could fix them up, we did. They were not comfortable.
Now, could you describe a Quonset hut?
Quonset hut is a half round.
Okay.
About 10 feet high, 16 feet, 18 feet wide. And you can get up against the wall, but it's a curved wall. Everything's curved. And then we had kerosene stoves to keep them warm.
Did you have anything in particular that you brought from home to fix up your Quonset hut?
Never got. Now I can fix it up as a best you can.
Record player or anything like that?
No,
Radio?
oh no. Radio, well, radios, see, we could buy all these things in the PX.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly out on ADAX, we would buy things from the Navy PX, which was much better stocked than the American. And later on, when we were buying whiskey, it was even better. The enlisted men used to buy the whiskey and sell it to the civilian companies used to build the runways. And they'd have these civilian workers were being paid $45 an hour. Some ungodly number.
It's a lot of money now.
And they'd sell them whiskey. They'd pay $50 for a bottle of whiskey the enlisted men had bought for $5.
Well, that brings up a question. What was the relationship like between the civilian workers and the enlisted men?
Had very little relationship.
Okay.
Yeah. The enlisted men were there, used to bitch because they weren't getting $45 a day, but or $45 an hour. But it was a, I think the enlisted men knew that they were lucky to be there. It was boring but safe.
Mm-hmm.
And it, I don't know what happened, but both the Army and the Air Corps out there got very good, complete libraries. Many of the books were paperback, but good variety. And if you really like to read, and I do, you're very comfortable.
Could I?
Well, I was with the Enquirer covering, among other things, the induction center out at Fort Thomas. And that's when the Sergeant Major said, if you've got a bad number, low number, you can volunteer for the Air Corps. And that was in July, and I was enlisted on August 1st, 1941. So I I could say I saw it coming. It was pretty obvious we were going to get into it. How and when and why was up to fate, but I was in, well, I went in as a enlisted man, and they didn't know really much about these one-year volunteers. That most of the people who would volunteer for the service volunteered for 3 years as a full-time. Well, I volunteered as a one-year volunteer, and then in October, a captain I was doing some work with said, you know, I could promote you to staff sergeant if you sign up for 3 years. So in October of 1941, I was discharged again and enlisted in the regular army for 3 years. Turned out I was right, I was interested almost 6. But then I was an enlisted man in San Antonio, up in Bandera State Park for an overnight with a friend. Anyway, on my way back, I had the radio on and listening to the Philharmonic. Interrupt this broadcast. Pearl Harbor has been bombed. I knew where Pearl was, but I had no idea the layout and what it happened. Of course, as things clarified, that same day, I found out what happened, and that was involved in World War II.
What was it like on the base when you got back? I mean, was it chaos or?
It was very orderly. The first order went out. Being in the Army, or in the Air Corps, Army Air Corps, in 1941, before December, was very comfortable. It was a job. I had something I enjoyed doing, and did a lot of sleeping, a lot of eating, and a lot of bridge, and then all of us, the first thing I said was, before December, we could wear civilian clothes most of the time. And the first order that went out was no more civilian clothes. You wear a uniform. And it was interesting, the contrast. The regular army, in particular, the officer, did not like the draftees, because we, for the most part, were better educated, more knowledge of what was going on in the world than they were. They were regular army officers. And then they started making us officers.
Well, sir, I'd really like to thank you for taking this opportunity to speak with us.
Glad to do it.
Fascinating stuff, and it's going to really be a great part of our collection here, so again, we thank you.